Hello, it's great to be here. My name is Sarah Dryden-Peterson, and I'm a professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. I'm going to begin with a question. And this question is, what would it take to ensure that all displaced young people would have access to learning that enables them to feel a sense of belonging and prepares them to build more peaceful and equitable futures? In Right Where We Belong, How Refugee Teachers and Students Are Changing the Future of Education, I show that where we are now in answering and acting on this question is both discouraging and hopeful. I present a story in the book that covers 15 years of ethnographic observations across 23 countries and more than 600 interviews. So what's discouraging? When I began my research in this field 15 years ago, the prevailing view was that education for refugees was a holding ground, designed to create a more stable present, but to defer the creation of a future. Most refugees had access to education only in separate schools for refugees, isolated from national education systems, and with the intention of providing temporary schooling with short-term goals. I was struck by how little this approach aligned with both the long-term nature of displacement. Refugees are now typically displaced for between 10 and 20 years. And the kinds of education I observed refugee communities creating for their own children in terms of building connections to national education systems and connected also to the purposes aligned to the futures that they imagined. These local processes of reimagining refugee education as future-oriented really entered global policy in 2012 with a new and quite radical, for a global approach, of including refugees in national education systems. This movement to include refugees, which is where we are today, is hopeful in what it promises, but I argue that it remains discouraging in practice. It's discouraging in terms of access. Almost half of children globally who still don't have access to school live in conflict and displacement. It's also discouraging in terms of quality. Our work in Kenya shows that early grade literacy outcomes among refugees are among the lowest in the world. And it's discouraging in terms of opportunity. In almost all countries where refugees live, they are non-citizens, likely never citizens, and they have limited rights to movement, to work, to capital, and to long-term residence. Even in a best-case scenario where refugee young people are able to access high-quality education, the future opportunities they believe that education promises to them remain closed. Take Khalwa, a 16-year-old Syrian girl who arrived in Lebanon when she was 9. Departure from Syria came as a surprise to her, and as she remembers it, one of the hardest moments was needing to leave behind her favorite teddy bear. In retrospect, she laughs at being worried about her toy, but her life in Syria at that time didn't force her to think about other things. In Syria, she watched a medical television show, which inspired her goal to become a doctor. Her kindergarten teacher encouraged this idea, and Khalwa remembers how she used to make me feel optimistic and say, "You're going to become a doctor. You'll achieve your dreams." This dream remained with Khalwa, and at 16 years old, it had become a specific goal, many pages long in her notebook, of becoming a surgeon who helps people in need for free. After Googling the requirements for this training in Lebanon, she wrote out a detailed series of steps covering the next 12 years of her life by which she would accomplish this goal. But each step was also accompanied by a set of factors over which she had no control. Would refugees be allowed to continue to go to school in Lebanon? Would she be allowed to work in Lebanon if she did become a surgeon? She had top grades, the kind that, according to the logics of exam systems, would facilitate her further study and enable her to reach medical school. But what Khalwa heard from her teachers when she began primary school in Lebanon shook her trust in whether these opportunities would be open to her. She explained that she began to think, maybe they're right. Maybe we are coming to Lebanon. It's not our country. We can't study here. We can't work here. We can't stay here. Maybe they're right. We are occupying their country. Khalwa and other refugee young people know they're at the mercy of cyclical and conflicting logics, educational policies that allow them to study, but social and economic and migration policies and politics that do not allow them to participate. But I said where we are now in refugee education is both discouraging and hopeful. So what is hopeful? I find that refugee teachers and students can and are reimagining refugee education in ways that do meet long-term purposes focused on opportunity, like Khawasat. Most importantly, they're doing this by finding ways to teach and learn that allow students to weave together their pasts, their presents, and their futures. Take Jacques. Jacques arrived as a refugee in Kampala, Uganda, without so much as a bunch of matoke, kind of banana, to feed his own family. But he dedicated himself to building a school. Jacques' idea of building a school was not so much to construct a physical structure, but rather to gather a core of teachers who would inspire learning. A school is not the building, it's the teacher, Jacques often says. He wrote down his goal for the school in red ink on a plain piece of white paper, in a file that he carried with him everywhere. Ensure for our children a basic education to prepare them for their future lives. Over the next 10 years, Jacques consistently demonstrated deep care for his students and acted unwaveringly to inspire their learning to prepare them for their future lives. For himself, Jacques' preferred future was to return home to Democratic Republic of Congo. In one's own village, that is where one really feels at home, he said. It is a place where the future can be imaginable. But in the context of ongoing war and no rule of law, where you could be killed no matter when and no matter for what reason, any sort of predictable future of return is not imaginable. Jacques had come to the conclusion that home then is what he can build for himself, his students, and his children, wherever they are. When you become a refugee, you must begin to live here, Jacques said, pointing to the ground beneath him, to emphasize that here is where one is from the moment of arrival. What I see in teachers like Jacques, and I hope we can all see, are ways to build the kinds of learning and belonging that can, piece by piece, enable more peaceful and equitable futures for all. Thank you.